to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. I'm in Osaka, Japan, where the G20 summit has just concluded during the weekend. On the sidelines of the G20 summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump met. And also that was amid a raging trade war between the world's two largest economies. During the meeting, President Xi mentioned the two countries' ping-pong diplomacy, adding that bilateral ties have seen development over 40 years. Xi believes both countries could only benefit from cooperation.
The impact of the China-U.S. trade dispute has been felt around the world, and all eyes were on this meeting in Osaka. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump agreed to restart trade talks on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Trump said the U.S. would not add new tariffs on Chinese goods, but tariffs imposed over the past year would remain in place. They agreed that relations should feature coordination, cooperation, and stability. Xi Jinping said China is sincere in continuing trade negotiations and managing differences with the United States. But negotiations should be based on equality and mutual respect and address each other's legitimate concerns. He said China and the U.S. are the world's two largest economies, and they will eventually have to find a mutually acceptable solution to their differences through dialogue and consultation. Xi Jinping said the two countries' interests and areas of cooperation have become highly integrated, and they should not fall into the trap of confrontation. He called on the United States to treat Chinese companies and students fairly and allow normal corporate links and people-to-people exchanges. And he said China must defend its core interests on issues involving its sovereignty and dignity. Donald Trump said he is not hostile to China and hopes for better bilateral relations. He said the U.S. hopes to engage in consultations to properly settle the trade imbalance and provide fair treatment for both countries' companies. And he called on China to increase imports from the United States. Noting that there are many excellent students in China, Trump said he always welcomes Chinese students to study in the United States. Great changes have taken place in the international situation and China-U.S. relations over the past 4 decades. But President Xi said one basic fact remains unchanged. China and the United States both benefit from cooperation and lose in confrontation. And cooperation and dialogue are better than friction and confrontation.
For more, we have in Hong Kong Xiao Geng, professor at the Peking University HSBC Business School. In Beijing, Tim Stratford, managing partner of Covington and Burling Beijing office. He's also the chairman of AmCham. Welcome to both of you here to our discussion. Professor Xiao, your takeaway from the interaction of the two leaders and certainly the result.
Well, I think this is an excellent result. President Trump actually mentioned that China and the U.S. could be strategical partners. So this means that they are now looking towards win-win situation. And given some of the suffering from the trade wars, both countries are suffered in the past. So I think this is a turning point, although it's going to take a lot of more work to work out the actual deals.
Really a lot of work. Mr. Stratford, we heard positive responses from both sides earlier. Will this time be carrying us a little bit forward in a longer term?
Well, I have exactly the same reaction. This is very good news because before these talks occurred, there was a fair amount of posturing on both sides that made us truly believe that the presidents on each side would be willing to walk away from the negotiations. The fact that they have emerged from the negotiating room and said that both sides are going to resume is very good news. At the same time, there is a lot more work to be done. For one thing, what we've heard about the discussions from the statements thus far are things that are really not central to the actual negotiations themselves. For example, we've heard that the U.S. is going to not impose additional tariffs at this point, and that helps both sides feel that they can continue the negotiations, but that's not really what the negotiations are fundamentally about. We also heard that the U.S., that President Trump may pull back some of the restrictions on American companies selling technology products to Huawei. But that also, even though that's very good news and it indicates that the leaders had important breakthroughs in their discussions, that's not really part of trade negotiations either. That has to do with separate issues relating to national security. With respect to the trade issues themselves, those really have to do with the systemic structural issues, the differences between our two systems and the conflicts that raise. And those still are issues that remain to be resolved in these discussions. We've been told that the countries are 90% of the way there, but the last 10% I think will be the most challenging.
Mr. Stratford, if I beg to differ, when you talk about Huawei, you frame it in a national security issue. However, many say it is very arguable whether it's a national security issue or an issue of a very different nature, and there is too much an extension of national security, the concept itself, in the overall dealing by this administration toward China. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you that the administration, particularly President Trump, has used the idea of national security in a very broad way. But if you talk to the actual trade negotiators, they would say that Huawei is a separate issue from these trade discussions. And in fact, to be fair, both governments have legitimate national security concerns about how they build their 5G networks. And these are issues that the two governments still have to resolve. And you can't just say, well, we have real concerns about 5G and the security issues related to that, but as long as you buy more soybeans for us, we'll disregard those security issues. So those are issues that both governments have, and they still need to be worked out. But it appears that the governments are prepared to have those discussions, so that's very encouraging.
Certainly, Mr. Stratford, you are having a kind of opinion that's shared by quite some among the business community. However, one has to point out, Professor Xiao, inside the United States, particularly the decision makers, policy makers these days, there are so many different kinds of camps. Those that are hardliners, those are not. Those are related to ideology, those are not. Those are talking about the national security. Those are mainly looking at the trade benefits. So you see so many different divisions of opinions. That is why the negotiation extremely difficult for China to grapple with. What do you think, Professor Xiao? Next step could be easier for China or even more difficult?
Well, I think it's good news that President Trump actually trying to separate the national security and the trade issues, which is very, very important. I think in the national security issues, both countries have concerns, but that actually can be dealt with separately. But on the trade issue, the key is not to disrupt this global supply chains. And also, the two countries actually can have win-win trade deal. You know, China can buy a lot of American goods. You know, American companies can also sell a lot in China and also through trade. And this is crucially important to help people's living standards and maintain the living standards, increase the living standards. And that should not be mixed up with the national security issues.
One of the things that's interesting, if you notice, the gentleman, is the fact that at the very beginning, during the opening statement made by both sides, when they were sitting in the room, facing the camera and trying to get engaged into a conversation which eventually lasted 80 minutes, the thing that they talked about are actually of very different nature. The Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about the overall nature of China-U.S. relations and the future of this critical bilateral relations. However, President Trump, coming from the U.S., mainly focusing on whether to have a deal or not to have a deal, and whether the deal is easy or not easy in terms of trade discussions. So how is that different visions about the discussions likely to frame the future nature of discussion between the two sides, particularly the two presidents, as to how they see the bilateral relations? Mr. Stratford.
That's a very good question. I think that both perspectives are important, and at the end of the day, I think it's important that each president should listen carefully to the perspective expressed by the other president, and that will help them to understand the other side better and come to a meeting of the minds. So I think you pointed out a very interesting distinction that's important to pay attention to.
All right, interesting. That's the adjective Mr. Stratford used. What about for you, Professor Xiao, knowing the geopolitics and the current stage of interaction, Professor?
Well, I think this reflects the difference in culture and also the political systems. In the U.S., the election is very, very important. So the president, of course, focusing on the short term. But in China, really, the Chinese leaders are looking at a much longer horizon and also look at the not just China's interest, but also the global interest. You know, how to really develop a global order where win-win is actually something you know, everybody can get to, instead of the lose-lose situations.
Earlier, both of you talked about Huawei. Of course, obviously, there are different ways of looking at that. For example, Wang Xiaolong, who is the Director General of the International Economic Department of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also the Sherpa for G20 coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from China, talking about Huawei as a private company, and therefore many of the things that Mr. Stratford, you mentioned earlier, national security, things like that, do not necessarily relate that much to what Huawei is all about. Now, will Huawei once again be one of the most important issues and apparently caught between the geopolitical crossfire in the near future? That's an interesting question, isn't it?
I think that there are a lot of issues related to Huawei that are yet to be resolved. In China, the distinction between a public and a private company is not quite the same as it may be in the United States. The government can have more influence here, and so I think that just making that distinction alone doesn't address all the concerns that that American national security experts might have.
Professor Xiao?
Well, I think in the U.S., the major influence by the government on enterprise is actually through the defense contract. And the U.S. defense budget is very, very big. So this is very different from the Chinese practice. You know, China actually, although there are some state-owned enterprises, but Huawei in this case is actually a private company, and it's just that it developed a very advanced technology, which would be likely to be widely used for civilian purpose, and maybe for military purpose as well in the future. But I think there's a huge difference between the way the U.S. and the China government influence the companies.
Right.
So I think the two sides should actually appreciate the differences and trying to find understanding.
The other thing, of course, is about WTO reform. Now, we all understand in the G20 summit declaration this time from Osaka, WTO reform was mentioned. In other words, economies attending the forum actually agreed on this consensus. However, how to see what kinds of reform, that is very different. Professor Xiao, U.S.-China, whether to look at the world trade system as a multilateral one or rather only bilateral, that's already one interesting question. The other thing is about how WTO reform will likely to play its role in terms of the U.S.-China economic and trade debate. What do you think, Professor, as we see the two teams coming from both sides trying to work out detailed issues, as the statement put out earlier, they were mentioning from China and the United States? Professor.
Well, I think WTO reform is extremely important because this is so far the only way international communities has established to really maintain and protect the global supply chains can work smoothly, and also does not allow any particular country to really dominate and at the cost of the rest of the world. So this is, I think, something so important for the common goods, and I'm glad that actually this meeting, every country has basically agreed we should reform. We should actually go back to this multilateral approach.
Mr. Stratford, appellate body of the WTO, several judges already out of the term, and therefore, if no new judges means a paralysis of the overall dispute settlement mechanism of WTO. U.S. certainly play a crucial role in this regard. Will that be resolved? Will that also become a thorny issue in certain nature in this economic and trade discussion between China and the United States?
I don't know how much it's being raised directly by China to the United States, but certainly it's a thorny issue, and the U.S. has a different view from the Europeans, from the Japanese, from many countries around the world. And so I think that is a difficult issue, and I hope that we can see some resolution soon, because it does threaten to cripple the dispute settlement capabilities of the WTO.
The other thing, of course, Professor Xiao, is about subsidies. Now, the issue about state-owned enterprises has been a dispute, has been a debate between China and the U.S. However, subsidies provided to companies, industrial subsidies, there are also agricultural subsidies many economies provided to their own agricultural industry. So how do you see the subsidies provided by various governments for various sectors according to their development stage? How eventually this will be the issue discussed by China and the U.S. as you see it?
Well, I think the subsidies exist in every country, and a lot of these subsidies are due to either national security concern or other strategical concern. So I think we should actually separate the national security and the basic market order. For those competitive market, nothing to do with national security, we don't need to have any, we should not have any subsidies. But just like in the U.S., the defense contract is a direct subsidy to the American companies, doing that kind of production. But in China, the state-owned enterprises, a lot of subsidies are actually for infrastructure, for public infrastructure. So there's a lot of ways to understand and the subsidies, and we should do careful work actually to find out what subsidies should be eliminated. Those subsidies, threaten uneven playing fields, I think should be eliminated. But some of the subsidies, they are basically for green economy, for infrastructure, for national security, which will exist in most countries.
Mr. Stratford, your thoughts?
I agree that subsidies is a very important problem and also a very complicated subject. The U.S. and the EU have had a long list of WTO disputes between the two because of subsidies alleged to be given to Boeing or subsidies alleged to be given to Airbus because of defense concerns and so on. So this is a difficult area. One thing that will be important to have the sorts of discussions that Dr. Xiao raised, and I agree with him, is that there needs to be a full reporting of subsidies in accordance to WTO rules. And one of the concerns that the U.S. has raised is that the government of China has not necessarily given timely and full reporting of its subsidies, and I think that's one of the steps that needs to be taken so that then subsidies can be better understood and discussed.
Professor Xiao, you want to respond briefly?
Oh yes, actually I agree. China, because of the economic systems are not so advanced, a lot of reforms are, to be carried out. So in a state-owned enterprise, a lot of reforms, particularly on subsidies, needs to be pushed forward. However, I think if the national security concern becomes more and more important, then that will affect China's reform, and particularly geopolitical, I mean, if there's a threat of war, of course, the government of China will probably likely to stop the SOE reforms. So I think it's very complicated, but I think on the whole, China has been pushing for reform, and I think the international community should actually help, to really help China to feel secure to push forward the reforms in this area. But I think the basic condition is that we should have peace and prosperity, so that all those reforms can be carried out smoothly. And
my final question for both of you is that Earlier, you mentioned about 90% so-called. Already two parties in a way come to certain kind of consensus according to some newsmakers. We do not know exactly whether that's true or not though, but the 10%, if it were, would be extremely difficult. Given that fact, Mr. Stratford, from your perspective, where to start with if the two working groups and teams coming from both sides settle down on both sides of the table and begin to discuss? What should they roll up their sleeves about at the very beginning?
Well, the 90% figure I've heard from trade officials from both the United States and China, although, you know, I think they saved some of the hardest questions towards the end, so it's hard to say that the 10% is equal to some of the other issues. I think the two sides actually have come a long ways. They've been working from a common draft. I think they know exactly where the differences of opinion lie. And again, I give tremendous credit to the trade negotiators from both countries. They've made an extraordinary effort. They've gone a long way, and we just wish them the best that they can cover this last 10%.
Professor Xiao, likely to be predictable
well,
or still unpredictable, or probably even more?
Well, I think now, I think we should feel more optimistic. The 10% are mainly related to so-called strategical issues and also the enforcement issues. And given that President Trump mentioned that China and the United States could be strategic partners, and also China also showed that you know, it wants reform, more opening and more you know, rule of law, you know, follow those you know, international standards. I think in principle those 10% could be resolved, although it's going to take time, and also the language would be a very difficult problem. Yeah, the English and Chinese have very different ways to express, you know, their substantive contents. You know, so that it's going to take some time.
We really hope that the negotiation is only going to be shaped by the negotiation itself, but of course we know it is much more complex than that. For now, I want to thank both of you for being with us and for your insights on the issue. Tim Stratford, Xiao Gang, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Stay with us here on World Insight. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As trade talks are back on track between China and the U.S., one major factor we cannot dismiss when talking about the economic is the labor force. The labor market is undergoing dramatic changes amid technological advances. To make sense of this important issue, I talked to Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labor Organization. Let's listen in. There have been a lot of keywords in the discussion. For example, multilateralism vis-a-vis unilateralism, joint effort vis-a-vis go along and me first. Meanwhile, innovation vis-a-vis one side take all. So how do you see these keywords will eventually be reflected in the consensus by the leaders coming from the G20 summit?
Well, let me start with the first word that you mentioned, multilateralism.
Yes.
As part of the multilateral system, you won't be surprised to hear me say that we think this is really important. You know, I think one thing which I find of concern, certainly in my own organization, is that dialogue is becoming a little bit difficult right now. People find it hard to sit down together, to talk, not just to talk, but to listen to the view of the others, and look for compromise solutions. And I think in the global economy, in the global perspective, multilateralism has to prevail. We have to come to solutions where everybody has given an opinion and everybody finds some sort of satisfaction in the result. So the winner takes all sort of attitude towards international policy making is simply unrealistic in the global interdependent economy that we have. So we believe in multilateralism, we believe in the dialogue, we also believe in the multilateral rules that should underpin, be it trade, be it employment questions. And the G20 is perhaps the most important place where these principles of multilateralism, of global rules, and respect for those rules can take precedence. So, you know, here in Osaka, very important things are happening.
What about the issue of geopolitics? Will that be defining factor, do you think?
The G20 was born in 2008, 2009, when we were all very worried that the financial system was going to collapse, and we were all very clear that unless there was an international effort to bring people together, something unpleasant was going to happen. Now, I think the great achievement of the G20 in its early years was that it overcame that financial crisis, and it made it clear that whatever geopolitical interests are involved, it's only through international cooperation that we're going to find the answers. So what applied, it's now 10 years ago, to financial crisis, applies today to trade, to climate change, to all of the other issues that the world, these global challenges that the world has to address together.
What about free trade, which is another key word, and it has a lot to do with employment opportunities.
Certainly.
Because many countries are building their economy based on trade, based on interactions globally.
Absolutely. I think we all know, and China is a great example, isn't it, that open trade and trade liberalization over recent decades has generated extraordinary results, as you've said, in terms of growth, in terms of jobs. I see trade, it's almost the petrol you put in the fuel tank of the global economy. So, you know, overcoming the tensions which certainly exist today has to be a high priority. But, you know, around that word free before trade, we're hearing fair, we're hearing reciprocal, you're hearing all of these.
A lot of adjectives.
So I think this notion of international policy coherence, we need trade, we need the fuel in the tank, but we also need to think of the other policies, accompanying policies, which will make sure that the benefits of trade, which are real and obvious, benefit everybody. This notion of balanced and inclusive global growth. So we have to think about the coherence across the policy agenda. And again, I think jobs, decent work is a big part of that.
You know, politicians have also been using that banner, however, in very different ways, Mr. Director General. And therefore, what kinds of employment and how to make sure employment for one does not mean unemployment for the other.
Correct.
And how to make sure politicians are not making use or making excuse of employment for whatever policies they're trying to push domestically. That is the issue.
I think you're right. I think we see a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of anxiety about the future. And as you've indicated, I think the important thing is that that type of feeling is directed in a positive agenda of cooperation internationally, not for more nationalistic or more isolationist purposes. I think we share that worry. And there, again, I think the answers lie in the hands of international cooperation. It is exactly the types of answers that the G20 can give that will help us push in the right direction. And no, the global economy, it does mean competition. We all know there is competition between economies. Everybody is talking about making themselves more competitive.
Yes.
So we're in a competitive world.
Everybody wants it to be, right?
And what's going to change? That's fine. But that is not a contradiction to the notion of cooperation internationally, you see, because if we are competing on a fair basis in acceptance of shared principles, shared values, then that competition can take place in a positive and entirely healthy way.
Absolutely.
And that's what we need to work towards.
But if the trade dispute, as we have seen between some of the largest economies in the world, and also leading to some problems in the other economies, if that continues, what does that mean for global employment opportunity?
If the global trading system runs into difficulties, if trade shrinks because of those difficulties, it is inevitable that growth will be reduced. There's already some signals in that regard, and jobs will be reduced, and living standards will suffer. So we all have a stake in making sure that this global trading system survives and is strengthened, and that we come together and overcome these tensions. I don't dismiss the importance of these conflicts, but we have to find ways through them. And I think the intention of everybody is to find solutions in that regard.
How do you see, in a way, the safe workplace and also opportunities free from harassment? That, I understand, is a campaign you've been working very hard with your colleagues around the world.
Yeah, we just came out of our centenary conference. The ILO is 100 years old. We're 100 years old yesterday.
Congratulations.
Thank you for that. Happy birthday indeed. And one thing we did on our 100th birthday was adopt a new International Labour Convention against violence and harassment at work. It's the very first international instrument. And you know, in the times we're living in, the Me Too campaign and much else, everybody knows that there is too much unhealthy activity in workplaces. People don't feel comfortable, people feel under pressure from people. We want a workplace which is free of any type of violence and harassment. And we're very, very hopeful that these new conventions and the recommendation will do just that. But you know, this is about human welfare at work, but there's perhaps an even more dramatic story than the elimination of violence and harassment, to which we are strongly committed. There's another fact. I just want to leave you with one statistic. Nearly 3 million people around the world every year die because of the work that they do, either in accidents or because of industrial disease. People don't talk about this, but we still have a big job to do to make sure that workplaces are not free only of violence and harassment. People should feel good at work, but also that their health is protected at work. This is not talked about enough, but we think this is one of the major challenges that remains to be met in the world of work.
Is this for developing countries and emerging economies alone?
It's everywhere. There are particularly some areas and some sectors which are problematic. They've been there for a long time.
Right.
But what we're seeing as well are emerging new problems of stress, of psychological difficult challenges at work, burnout. We hear so much about people being burnt out at work, and we tend to say, well, they should be a bit stronger. Well, no, they should have a workplace and a work environment that helps them to get ahead in decent conditions, to balance their family life with their professional life as well. We all feel these problems. We all feel these stresses.
Another important question is about innovation and development. How to make sure at the time of dramatic and very progressive, shall we say, technological improvement, human employment opportunities are also going to be protected, while the people at work is also going to be provided with the capability to grow and continue to secure their jobs.
I think that what we're going to see is not a disappearance of work, not the beginning of a period of job scarcity. I don't think so. But we are certainly going to see a dramatic, possibly unprecedented transformation of work. Many of the jobs that exist today will disappear, but many new ones will come into being. The real secret in this, or the real challenge, is to get people from where they are today to where they need tomorrow. And this means skills training, it means retraining throughout working lives, it means preparing people for the era of digitalization, but it also means preparing for the other challenges. Demographic challenges. Some of our countries are aging, others are still very young, and it also means taking on the challenge, which should not be forgotten, of climate change. You know, if we believe that climate change is the result of human activity, I believe that, most of that human activity is work, or it is related to work. So you can see that the link between the world of work and production and the fight against climate change is a very clear one.
At the concluded G20 summit, group of 20 leaders joined their host, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in showcasing support for women to close the gap with men in finance and other kinds of forms of economic empowerment. Earlier, I have caught up with Silvana Kalkumarin, president and founder of Women Political Leaders, who was just off from the session when I was talking to her. Women Political Leaders, or the WPL, is a worldwide network of female politicians, top female politicians. Its mission is to increase the number and influence of women in political leadership worldwide. Let's listen in. Which stage do you think about walking the talk right now?
So for politics, unfortunately, there is still a lot of walking to do. Talking is happening. There is overall, globally, there is a recognition that we need more women in political leadership. But the actual figures show we still have a long way to go. Just to give you, like, of the G20 leaders level, the heads of state, heads of government, it's 94% men, 6% only of prime ministers, of presidents are women, which means there's a lot of catching up to do.
But how to catch up? That is really the issue, isn't it?
You can see a lot of change. For example, in Canada, in France, South Africa, Mexico, they have parity both in their governments and also in some cases parity in their parliaments. And usually this takes both very strong and bold leadership by saying we want to have this agenda, we want to have this parity, and we want to show political representation mirrors our societies. And also sometimes laws are needed, or legal inaction, quotas, affirmation, so that also the pipeline is there, that more women come forward as candidates.
Now you see many political leaders in the room, including U.S. President Donald Trump together with his daughter, and also the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President as well, many others too. How do you think they're responding to the messages you've been sending out?
What in politics matters is to see that there is a general support, there is an importance put by many organizations, and to get this message by UN Women, by ILO, by World Trade Organization, WHO, women political leaders, and all the others.
Comprehensive.
Exactly. Everybody says the same thing. So this leaves behind an impression, and this is such a big demand by so many big organizations that this cannot be sort of marginalized and said this is something we're not really taking seriously. So I think there is a big step forward happening now.
You see that in different politics, women empowerment is being shaped in different ways. Some presidents coming in and does believe that is an important issue. Others tend to throw that away because they have other priorities. How do you think the importance of this topic and the sustainability of this topic, what is the best way to always put there on the top of the political agenda?
If you have a big number of women as policymakers, as politicians, it's not an issue that can be forgotten. But that's a matter of numbers, so that if the numbers are big, it isn't a minority issue. And if you look at society, 50%, sometimes more than 50% in some countries, of the society are women. So it's both a leadership issue that the top leader should make it his agenda. It's necessary that in political representation there is a significant number of women, and society needs to really be supportive and also be demanding that change.
The G20 summit have a lot of debate about some very critical issues. Unilateralism vis-a-vis multilateralism, protectionism vis-a-vis free trade, innovation vis-a-vis, whether it's within my border or beyond. We look at all these big topics. Topics like women empowerment also likely to be sidelined, just to be honest. So what do you make of this? In the final statement, what do you expect should happen?
The women empowerment issue is not a side issue, but it's mainstreamed into everything. That it's mainstreamed into innovation. We need women as innovators. We need their views, their expertise, their genius, their talent to innovate. If we leave out 50% of the world's creativity and smartness, we don't innovate as much. We need women in digitalization. We would need women in trade. We need women as entrepreneurs. So it's not an issue separate from others, but it needs to be included in everything.
People wonder and argue whether women leaders are taking advantage of their role as a woman in order to promote themselves into the political offices and even into the higher positions. What do you make of these kind of arguments?
Politics is a job where you need to be very much on your toes every day. And if you stop promoting yourself, it's difficult to go on. This goes as much, if not more, for men as it does for women. So the argument is more what is politics like than what are women in politics like. And my absolute commitment and my belief is that if you have more women in politics, maybe policies and the style of politics also changes. We haven't tried it yet, so because we're at very, very low figures with women in politics, and I think the leadership of the world, more diversity, would definitely be good for it.
You served for years in the European Parliament, and now you are still being the organizer of the political leadership, women political leadership around the world. What do you think should be the next step if we are thinking about step by step?
We need to solve the world's problems together, that no country by itself can do it, that climate change does not stop at a border. Innovation, digitalization is not something that happens within the borders of one country. It's a global issue, so we need to work together. And this was something that the women there very much underlined, and they, I think the way they deal with each other, they talk to each other, is from the style something that is very positive and also gives optimism to how we can deal with each other.
And finally, before we go, if there's one message that our audience could carry with them out of this interview, and for the political leaders of the G20 summit, they could carry it home, what exactly is it from you?
So for the politicians, very clear message: get rid of laws that treat women differently to men. That's a very clear ask, very easy to do for legislators. They change laws. For all the viewers, make sure that whoever you support with your vote, with your thoughts, is it man or woman, make sure that they have on their agenda the women empowerment agenda.
All right, Silvana, thank you so much.
Thank
Congratulations once again for this wonderful job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Yi Tianwei and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insight across China and around the world. Good night.